we're going to get on to what I am most excited to share today, which is when we look at Jesus's longest parable. So here we are, and Jesus's longest parable is about 388 words, and that is the parable of, sometimes called the prodigal son, the parable of the two sons in Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through to 32. And it's very interesting because in order to understand this, and I hope everyone's quite familiar with it, but you'll get more familiar with it today, you find that we've got to look at the audience. And the audience is described in the first two verses of Luke 15, where it says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" So we have two groups of two. We have tax collectors and sinners, religiously bad people, and Pharisees and scribes, supposedly religiously good people who know the Bible very well, particularly scribes, because their job is to actually copy out the Bible. That's one of the main things that the scribes do, particularly the first 5 books of the Bible, particularly even the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And scribes also, one of the things a scribe has to do, at least we know from later scribes, is they have to distinguish two similar phrases so they don't mistake them when they copy. They actually have to count up how many times particular phrases occur so that they don't make a mistake when they copy. So then to this group, Jesus tells 3 stories. The first story is about 100 sheep, one of which is lost by going away. As I've said, it's framed as a question. The next story is about 10 coins, one of which is lost at home. Then and it's framed as a question. Then he tells a story of 2 sons, and it is not framed as a question. One of these sons is lost by going away from home, the younger son, into a far country. The other son, the elder son, is lost at home. So in other words, the 2 parables that precede prepare you for the third one, which actually tells you you can be lost by going away and the shepherd's happy when he finds them. You can be lost at home and the woman is happy when she finds the coin lost at home. God is going to be happy whether you're lost, when you're refound, whether you come back, or whether you're only lost at home. Then the parable ends without an ending. It doesn't tell you how the older brother responds, because it's an invitation to the older brother to respond and experience the happiness that God will have when and the celebration if they return. Now, the earliest manuscript of this passage, Luke chapter 15, it's in Rome, probably from the 3rd century. It actually has this paragraph mark. That's a break in the line. That's that vertical arrow. And then it puts the beginning of the next line out into the margin. That's where the story of the woman is beginning. Then here is where the parable of the 2 sons is beginning. Again, it's a break in the line, and then it's stuck out into the margin. So these paragraphs and the earliest writings of the New Testament almost certainly had paragraph marks. They don't, and often they get copied, and so we should use those for interpretation. But when actually the story is told, there's no paragraph break in the middle of it. The whole story just flows through. You deal with the younger brother and the older brother just in one go. Jesus begins his story. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me." And he divided his property between them. On the legal side, in response to the question, the father divides the property between them. Both of them get property. Probably the younger son gets movable property, things that you can move. The older son gets the entire farm. So the older brother does very well. In Jewish law, an older brother would inherit twice as much as the younger brother. So the older brother does very well through this arrangement. That's important to understand. Now, let's think about a story. A man had two sons. Who in the Bible had two and only two sons? Well, a younger son moves away and wastes his property. In the next chapter, the very beginning of the next chapter, the very next thing to come, Jesus tells a story about a rich man, and he had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. So we actually have two stories about wasting in a row, two stories about wasters. And that story about the unjust manager is very clearly of Palestinian origin. I shared this before, but you have specific measures for oil and for wheat, and phrases like sons of light and unrighteous mammon, which are only found in Palestinian in Palestine. Now, the younger son goes away, and it says he spent everything. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So my question is this: why does he end up feeding the pigs? One answer is this: because he wasted his money. That's his own fault. That's why he's feeding the pigs. But this parable gives us two reasons why he ended up feeding the pigs. Not only did he spend everything, but also he was very unlucky, and he happened to choose as the place to go the one country where there was a severe famine. There isn't a severe famine everywhere. The severe famine is in the land he chooses. Now, this is a very powerful part of Jesus's parable, because we often think of him as the prodigal son, the son who is only in trouble because of his own sins. And this parable gives us two reasons for his trouble. One is his sins, and the other one is his bad luck. And this is a fascinating way of dealing with someone's poverty, because we often like to think, is the poor person poor because of something they've done wrong, or because of something that's done to them, or whatever? Here, in this particular situation, Jesus tells a perfectly balanced story. Now, it's very common for people who come from countries where they don't experience food shortage, for them not to notice the famine in this story, but the famine is absolutely key to it. So the man goes out and he hires himself out to one of the citizens of the country. Now, this is a brilliant part of Jesus's story, because he uses one word which says a lot. Just by using the word citizen, he tells you, of course, the younger brother was not a citizen. So it's a very powerful word choice. He then, when he talks about the younger brother coming back, he uses the one word they began to celebrate, again with one word indicating that celebration goes on. He tells you with one phrase that the older brother was in the field, but he doesn't tell you what he's doing in the field. But we presume he seemed to be working. He seems to be working after other people are celebrating. He seems to be working hard. So Jesus, in his storytelling with these 388 words, manages to get a lot of information into a small space. Then we have this amazing thing when the older brother gets angry with his father, and he says to him, look, these many years I've served you, I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a goat, a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. What's so interesting here is that with the word look, he's told us a lot, with one word in Greek, because whenever the younger brother refers to his father, 3 times he calls him father. He addresses him always as father. The older brother does not. So Jesus is using here the absence of a word to pack punch into the story. Even this bit where the older brother says, you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends, is very powerful, because of course the older brother was not vegetarian all these years. In fact, what we see here is we see the resentment, and we also see that the older brother wants to celebrate with his friends. Celebrate is one of the theme words in this chapter. Again and again, the shepherd celebrates, the woman celebrates. But here we have the older brother who doesn't want to celebrate with his father. He actually wants to celebrate with his friends away from his father. So in other words, although he is physically close to his father, he wants to be a long way away. So this is a very powerful way in which Jesus tells his story. This is one sign of genius, that he says a lot with a few words. And even the missing ending, where we know how it ended for the younger brother, we don't know how the older brother responded. That's a very powerful thing. Now I want to look at how Jesus stretches the scribes. He's not only talking to tax collectors and sinners and telling a very, very, very simple story. He's also telling a story which stretches the powerful intellects of the scribes, who know the Bible really well because they copy it out by hand. So he begins and says, a man had two sons. Well, who had two and only two sons in the Bible? The most famous person to have two and only two sons is, of course, Isaac. And he has an older son, and the younger son cheats the older son out of the entire inheritance. So the older brother gets no inheritance at all. The older brother is therefore very angry. Therefore, the younger brother has to go off into a far country. So it's similar to the story, but there's also a contrast. Because in the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob goes into a far country with nothing, gets rich from Uncle Laban, and then comes back with lots of things. So you get similarities between an Old Testament story and also some contrast. But there's more, because as Jesus says, a man had two sons. You see, in that story of Jacob and Esau, Esau was a man who was out in the field. He's actually called a man of the field, where Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. But then Esau went out into the field and he got starving. In fact, he said, I'm so hungry, I'm about to die. Well, remember in Jesus's parable of the two sons, it's the younger brother who says, here I am, dying of starvation. And what happens with that older brother, Esau, in the book of Genesis, is when he is starving, he sells his birthright. Whereas in Jesus' story, when the younger brother is starving, he comes back to his senses and knows he can go back to his father. So in other words, the whole story is turned on its head. And the brilliance of what Jesus does is he tells a story that makes complete sense if you know none of the Old Testament. It's a simple story that works on the surface. But if you know the Old Testament, it's powerful because Esau is very angry, and he's been cheated out of his entire inheritance. In Jesus' story, the older brother is angry, even though he got to have lots of inheritance. Now, then in Jesus' story, while the younger brother is still a long way off, the father runs towards him, embraces him, and kisses him. Well, the only time in the entire Old Testament that anyone runs and embraces and kisses someone is in Genesis 3 verse 4, where Esau runs, embraces Jacob, and kisses him. Now, Esau had been cheated out of all his inheritance and then forgave his younger brother. And we know that scribes knew this passage well. I give you here two different Hebrew manuscripts of this passage. And just at this point, you can see these are dots over a word. You see those dots over the word, and these dots here on this manuscript. That's on the word, and he kissed him, Yishakehu in Hebrew. That was a particular word that every scribe needed to know, because there were 15 times in the Torah, the first five books of the Bible, that they had to put dots on words This was one of them. So Jesus appeals to them, to something they particularly know. And look, if Esau could forgive his brother when he was cheated out of everything, and Esau's a pretty bad guy, what are you doing resenting a younger brother? What are you doing resenting the fact that tax collectors and sinners are coming to Jesus? Now, in addition to those strong connections, there are many softer connections in the stories. A man has two sons, the older brother in the field, the man saying he's dying of hunger, cheating out of inheritance. Also, the young goats. There are young goats in the story of Jacob and Esau, because remember how Jacob cheats his father. By the way, Jacob's father cannot see a long way off. He's blind. So therefore, Esau has to come close. In fact, 6 times in the passage, and any scribe copying the word draw near 6 times will notice the word draw near. So we notice how Jacob drew near to his father Isaac wearing his brother's robes. Now remember, in the story of the 2 sons, the father says, quick, get out the best robe and put it on him. Whose robe was the best robe? Well, probably the older brother's. And of course, it was goat's skin that Jacob put on his hands in order to cheat his father. So you have many links between these stories. The father who can see far away versus the father who can't even see up close. What's more, Esau, remember, was very angry. He stayed at home and he was waiting for his father to die. That seems to be what this older brother is wanting to do. He wants his father dead. But what's interesting is this: Esau forgave his little brother who cheated him out of everything. So if Esau, who was so bad in the Bible and who gave up spiritual things just for some food, even he could forgive his brother. That's a very, very powerful message to scribes and Pharisees. So that's a brilliant part of Jesus' story. It works at the simple level, but a bit like a Pixar movie that has jokes for the adults as well as things for the children. This works at a story at a level which is very, very deep as well. It's got careful word choice. Each word is very powerful, and it's very morally challenging. So that's the brilliance of Jesus's story. Jesus knows the Old Testament really well as well. That's another thing we're getting more, and we're going to get more. But first, we're going to have some questions, and then we're going to have a break. So first, for questions.
All right, we'll start with this question. Do you perceive Jesus as a writer or as purely an oral teacher?
So Jesus isn't recorded as writing other than in the disputed passage about the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. So I think he could write, but he is recorded as reading in Luke chapter 4. He stands up in the synagogue and reads from the scroll. So I think he taught people orally. That doesn't mean they could take notes. So some people had wax tablets. You'd have a tablet maybe of wood with beeswax on top, and you could rub it out and reuse it. There are different ways people could write. I don't know whether his disciples wrote down his teachings at the time he said them, but I do believe that Jesus repeated himself a lot, and they're with him for 3 years. So they get a chance to hear him say things again and again. And some people, maybe even on this Zoom call, may have heard me say the same thing lots of times, and probably they're able to repeat it. So it's not that they have to memorize things straight away. I'm not saying people memorize 12 minutes of the Sermon on the Mount in one go. No, Jesus teaches them all day long, and it's a set piece lesson which he teaches in multiple places. So that's why the disciples know it so well. Jesus probably told this story quite a few times. That's why the disciples know it really well. When you've made up a story as good as this, give us that story another time, Jesus. So I think that's where a lot of us can tell the story of Goodnight Moon or the hungry caterpillar. If we've had children, the very hungry caterpillar, we can tell it again and again because our children have asked for it several times. And they'll know if we change a word. So I think that's the way in which you can have exact transmission of the stories of Jesus.
Thank you. Our next question asks, assuming that you believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, do you believe that its paragraph structure is inerrant in both the New Testament and the Old Testament?
Thank you. Great question. And the answer is no. So I see paragraphs as what I would call paratext, something alongside the text. Clearly, scribes felt more at liberty to change paragraphing than they felt to change wording. This indicates that the scribes attached a greater importance to wording than to paragraphing. But paragraphing is a bit like something with a half-life that decays over time. The easiest thing, if you're a copyist, is just to keep the paragraphing from the person before. So that's why I think we have paragraph marks from the original authors, which are preserved. I would say that the first 5 verses of John's Gospel are a separate paragraph in all of the early witnesses we have. And so it's not that we know all of the early paragraphs, but our starting point for interpretation should be people who are closer to the things than we are. So that's why I want to use the very, very earliest manuscripts and say, how did they divide up this? I far prefer that to a modern commentator who doesn't do that. So let's begin with early manuscripts, and we get great insights from that.
Great. Our next question asks, does the parable of the 2 sons also relate in some ways to Israel's exile?
It may do. So I'm going to look at some, the next session is going to be on the parable of the 2 sons. And I find a whole connection of things. There are often Israel is likened to a sheep. So in rabbinic parables, so the wandering sheep can work as Israel, and Jacob can stand for Israel. So yes, you've got Israel and Edom. You can do some sort of connection like that. I think that could be fruitful.
Okay, moving on to our next question. It asks, since Luke wrote that Jesus told them a parable, singular, in 15 verse 3, and then told stories of the lost sheep, lost coin, and lost son, do you see them as all one complex parable? And if so, how does that influence your interpretation?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I did misspeak and was aware, even as I misspoke, when I talked about them each as separate parables. It is one singular parable there. And I think that's a better way. And there is a common element between them. I mean, when you see one going away, the sheep goes away, the coin stays at home, the son goes away, the son stays at home. That's where, in a sense, it's one parable or one comparison. That there is a very close connection between them. Then you get to the missing ending, but you know how the missing ending ought to go, because you know how the woman celebrates when the coin is found. So I think it is one complex parable. At the same time, in Matthew's gospel, we have the parable of the sheep as an independent story. So let's put it this way. Maybe it's a bit 3 and 1, which a Christian can manage.
Great, thank you. Our next question asks, did the ability of Jesus, his ability to alliterate, read the scrolls, etc., and his general education level fit a person who would be a typical carpenter's son at that time period and in the area?
Probably not. So, I mean, people are amazed at Jesus and they say, where did he get this from? Where did he get this wisdom? Jesus is atypical. Now, he is the one who invented language. So I have got no problem with the person who invented language speaking Greek. At the same time, we have these things twice in Luke chapter 2 where he grows in wisdom. And so I think it's a bit of a mystery how he knows what he knows. But in Luke, we're given some hint that he's quizzing, as a 12-year-old, he's quizzing the experts in the temple. So if he took every opportunity to learn, then there's plenty of opportunity to learn. Let's say there are people where, I mean, he actually works in construction. So the word carpenter that we translate carpenter isn't just woodworker, it's actually involved in building as well. Some of the main building things that were happening, Herod Antipas was building what for a while was his capital of Galilee, 4 miles away from Nazareth. So that may be where a lot of the work was. Don't think it was making antique furniture for people in Nazareth. No, so this is, there's a lot of construction going on, and you invoice clients, there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, we actually have from Egypt a nice contract for a carpenter to build something, and you know, things have to be written out legally because there's construction costs involved. So if someone in that situation takes every opportunity that they have to learn, there's an awful lot that someone can learn. But I also think that Jesus is the most intelligent human that ever lived. I mean, he knew people's thoughts. He knew that a man would be carrying a water jar in a village he wasn't in, and exactly when it would be happening. So how we say Jesus got this genius, whether we say he knew everything except for the hour of his return, which it tells us he didn't know, or whether we say he only knew the things that he would have learnt plus the few extra things it tells us he knew, like he knew their thoughts, or somewhere in the middle, orthodoxy has quite a wide scope it can exist in. And so I would say, I don't know how this, I'm just saying, if we look at the 4 or so hours we have of Jesus's teaching, it shows genius. And people regularly forget this because we tend to think of Leonardo da Vinci as a genius because we have his pictures, we have his drawings, we think of Einstein, we have his equations, but with Jesus, we think of him as a smart peasant, and the clever stuff is Paul and Christianity and the early Christian thinkers. No, Jesus, the brightest guy who ever lived, as testified by these 4 hours of teaching. That's what is really smart. And it's morally smart, and the smartest people are also simple. So his teaching is very simple. But there's a lot more to it.